A fully loaded Airbus A340 carrying nearly 300 passengers and crew speeds down the runway on takeoff from Melbourne, Australia. The end of the runway is fast approaching, but no matter how hard the first officer pulls on his controls, his plane won't take off. Its tail scrapes along the ground violently, sending sparks flying. Passengers are horrified as a haunting red glow fills the cabin. Will they make it into the air before it's too late? Or will they come crashing off the end of the runway in what would be the worst air accident in Australia's history? This is the terrifying story of Emirates Flight 407, and it's a story that has very little to do with runways and engines, and everything to do with human psychology. On the night of Friday, March 20th, 2009, 257 passengers and 18 crew boarded Emirates Flight 407 at Melbourne in Australia. They were bound for Dubai, a 14-hour journey. It was a perfect night for flying. Light winds and no clouds to speak of. The plane being used for the flight was a 5-year-old Airbus A340 500, a modern 4-engined aircraft with an excellent safety record, and one of the few which could carry out this ultra-long journey without stopping to refuel. Owing to the long duration of the flight, there were not 2 but 4 pilots on board. 2 of them would carry out the takeoff and landing, while the other 2, the so-called augmenting crew, would take over during the cruise portion of the flight to allow the main crew to rest. As per Emirates Airlines procedures, the augmenting crew were required to be in the cockpit not just for the cruise, but also for the pre-flight preparations and during takeoff and landing. Emirates, like many airlines, deemed that the extra pair of eyes and ears could be put to use on these long flights to provide an added margin of safety. This makes what's about to happen on the ground here all the more baffling. As the passengers filed in and the last of the baggage was loaded, the pilots were busy carrying out the all-important pre-departure procedures. This was an experienced crew. The captain and first officer each had more than 8,000 hours of flying experience. Between them, they had thousands of hours in the A340 and many more in its smaller 2-engine cousin, the A330. But on this night, rather than being a strength, their experience with a slightly different aircraft would make a crucial difference. During these preparations, the aircraft was buzzing with activity. There were 5 people in the cockpit, the 2 pilots, 2 ground engineers, and the augmenting captain. So crowded was the cockpit, in fact, that the augmenting first officer had to stand outside in the forward galley and wait for the ground engineers to leave. As the pilots and ground engineers chatted, the first officer and captain reviewed their paperwork. And this is where the first officer made a simple but serious mistake. It all started when he entered the aircraft's total weight, its gross weight, into the electronic flight bag, or EFB. This is basically an iPad, which is specially designed to calculate the configuration the plane needs to be in for takeoff. Using the figures the first officer provided, the EFB calculated the flap setting which would be needed for takeoff, the thrust setting needed on the engines, and the speed at which the plane would be able to lift off. When he typed in the weight of the aircraft, his finger slipped. Instead of typing in 362.9 tons, the actual weight of the aircraft, he typed in 262.9 tons. In other words, he had told the computer which calculates the aircraft's performance on takeoff that the plane was a full 100 tons lighter than it actually was. What this meant was that the computer completely underestimated the amount of power the engines would need to get the plane into the air. It also underestimated the flap setting needed to produce the lift required for takeoff, and it underestimated the speed required to get off the ground. However, as consequential as this mistake was, there is a high level of redundancy built into not just aircraft systems, but procedures as well. The 4 pilots on board would have several chances to notice this mistake before they lined up on the runway. Speaking of redundancy, if you're like me, you probably feel like most internet browsers are kind of outdated by now. It feels like the internet itself has gotten so much more active and animated in the last few years, but web browsers like Chrome and Safari are still pretty clunky to use. That's why I use Opera One. It's basically the Airbus A350 of web browsers. I love the sleek modern interface with all of the apps I use within reach on this sidebar, so they're easy to find no matter how many tabs I have open. Like, let's say I'm doing some research for one of these videos, and I want to post something interesting I find on Instagram or Twitter. Sorry, X. I can just click those icons on the sidebar and post it. In the same way, I can just pop open WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger to reply to a message instantly. It's all really fast and seamless. It's also great having a built-in VPN and ad blocker, which I can turn on with a single click. I'm one of those people who has way too many tabs open at any given moment, so for me, the tab islands feature is especially useful. I can just group similar tabs together and expand and shrink them as needed. This really helps with organizing my work, and it saves a lot of space. I also like that Opera's own AI, Aria, is embedded into the browser itself, so whenever you have a question which would take too long to Google, you can just pop open Aria and ask it. Try Opera 1 using my link in the video description, so you can see what I'm talking about for yourself. But for now, back to the video. The captain took the EFB and began checking the figures entered by the first officer. Meanwhile, the first officer began writing these figures into his copy of the flight plan. But as the pilots were doing this, the captain got distracted by a comment made by one of the other people in the flight deck. After responding to it, he never fully completed his checks. If he had, he would have discovered that the first officer had entered the wrong figure for the aircraft's weight, and therefore that all of the figures the EFB had generated for the aircraft's performance at takeoff were wrong. The captain now entered these false figures into the flight management computer, the aircraft's brain. Importantly, at this point, both pilots were supposed to check verbally between each other that the takeoff weight entered into the EFB and the figure written into the flight plan by the first officer matched. This crucial check would clearly reveal that the first officer had entered the wrong figure into the EFB, one which was 100 tons lighter than the figure in the flight management computer. But this verbal confirmation never took place. There was now one less check standing between the pilots and disaster. As the 257 passengers settled in, they had no idea that up front in the cockpit, a small error was slipping through the cracks with alarming ease. As they neared the end of their checks, the pilots had a final chance to detect their mistake. The first officer read out the figures from his copy of the flight plan, and the captain checked that these figures matched those in the flight management computer. This is a photocopy of the first officer's flight plan. When he read out the figure for the takeoff weight, here, he started by saying 326.9 tons, and then, noticing that the figure he had written was 100 tons off, he changed the 2 to a 3, and then read out the correct figure of 362.9 tons. On this copy of the flight plan, you can just about see the line he added to turn what was a 2 into a 3. The captain confirmed that this figure was the one in the flight management computer, so as far as he was aware, all was well. The thing to remember here is that this was the correct weight in the flight management computer, but that didn't matter, because all of the takeoff performance figures, which had been calculated using the EFB, the iPad, had been done using an incorrect weight of 262.9 tons, and it was these faulty results of the calculations which the pilots had now entered into the aircraft's brain. At this point, the first officer could have decided to check the figures again, just in case, given that he had noticed a discrepancy in what he had written in the flight plan and what was in the flight management computer. But the captain had already checked his figures as far as he knew, and besides, he figured that he must have simply made a mistake when writing the number into the flight plan rather than when entering it into the EFB. So, with that, the cabin doors closed, along with the door of opportunity for the pilots to notice their error. At 18 minutes past 10 that night, Flight 407 pushed back from the gate 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The final domino had fallen before the plane had even reached the runway. The pilots started the aircraft's 4 Rolls-Royce engines and began taxiing out to runway 16 at Melbourne. Their route would take them south initially, and then out to the west towards Dubai. It was the first officer's leg, so he taxied the aircraft along the ground, while the captain went through the before takeoff checklists. As they taxied out, the pilots set the flaps to the first setting, rather than to the second or third, where they would have been if the correct aircraft weight had been entered into the EFB. As a result, when the aircraft began taking off, the wings would generate less lift, making it harder for the plane to get airborne. At 10:30 that night, Flight 407 lined up on the runway. Now, nothing stood between the pilots and the mistakes they had made back at the gate. The first officer pushed the thrust levers to the flex thrust setting, and the 4 engines roared to life. The massive 360-ton plane began barreling down the runway. The thrust setting used was a reduced power setting used to limit wear and tear on the engines. It was much less than what the plane needed, which was toga thrust, or takeoff go-round thrust, the engine's maximum setting. As a result, acceleration was slow. But this slow acceleration didn't strike the pilots as particularly odd. They were used to a wide range of accelerations on the A340, which, in any case, has something of a reputation as a sluggish aircraft. As the plane continued down the runway, the captain called out 100 knots. The aircraft was now in what is known as the high-speed regime, where only a small number of emergencies are justification for an aborted takeoff. The pilots could feel the aircraft speeding up as the rhythmic bumping of the nose wheel on the runway centerline lights became faster. Then, they reached the speed marked as V1, the point of no return. Now, the pilots were committed to the takeoff, no matter what happened to the plane, be it an engine fire, a burst tyre, or anything else. To abort the takeoff after this speed would be to risk going off the end of the runway. Seconds later, it reached VOR, rotation speed. The first officer pulled on his side stick to bring the nose of the plane into the air. The only problem was that these speeds were based on calculations for a much lighter aircraft. VOR had been calculated as being 145 knots, almost 20 knots too slow for how heavy the plane was. In reality, the plane would not be able to make it into the air until it was travelling at least 163 knots, or 300 kilometers per hour. But with these calculations already made, the pilots would have to find this out the hard way. The first officer pulled on his side stick, but the nose didn't rise. He pulled back further, but still nothing happened. Terrifyingly, the plane continued accelerating down the runway with no sign that it would lift off. The aircraft was now less than 1,000 meters from the end of the runway, and the strip of lights marking the threshold were now coming into view. The pilots were running out of options. There was no way they could abort the takeoff at this point. The captain told the first officer to pull back on his side stick for a second time. The first officer pulled back more, and finally, the nose of the plane rose. But to the pilot's horror, the rest of the plane didn't follow. The first officer continued pulling back, and the nose rose higher and higher, but they could see from their instruments that the height above the ground remained 0. The first officer, now desperately trying to get the aircraft to climb, kept pulling back until the tail of the aircraft slammed into the runway. Sparks went flying as the aluminium fuselage ground against the runway at almost 300 kilometers per hour. The impact was so severe that the flight data recorder, one of the plane's black boxes, fell off its rack onto the fuselage skin itself. The skin of the aircraft was being shredded, and passengers could smell smoke and burning metal and insulation. The cabin was lit with a terrifying red glow. In a matter of seconds, the plane would careen off the end of the runway. Seeing this, the captain shoved the engines to maximum thrust. It was a last-ditch effort. At this point, he was sure that it was over, for him and his almost 300 passengers and crew. In the blackness beyond the runway lights lay certain disaster. Travelling at over 160 knots, or 300 kilometers per hour, the plane went off the end of the runway, its tail scraping along the mud. And then finally, its main wheels left the ground. A split second later, the tail followed it. But the plane was barely climbing. Its tail struck the localizer antenna, puncturing the skin of the aircraft. Then, it crashed through one of the runway lights. This emergency was far from over. The first officer limped the damaged aircraft into the sky, desperate not to sink back down into the ground. As they climbed timidly out, a warning appeared on their central display. Tail strike. The tower controller too had seen the sparks generated by the tail as it scraped against the runway, and they alerted the pilots. As if it wasn't already clear, the crew knew that they wouldn't be continuing to Dubai. They needed to get back to Melbourne. But now, their heavy weight came to haunt them again. Except this time, it had to do with their fuel. With over 130 tons of it on board, the plane was well above its maximum landing weight. The pilots would need to dump a lot of fuel before they could return to the airport. Air traffic control cleared the flight to climb to 7,000 feet and directed them out over the water to dump fuel. The crew's adrenaline was surging at this point. If the captain hadn't pushed the engines to maximum power at the last moment, they could very well have crashed through the trees at the end of the runway igniting a fireball. But they couldn't let this adrenaline get to them. They would need every ounce of concentration to assess the damage and formulate a plan to get back to Melbourne. A key part of that plan was finding out how much fuel they would have to jettison in order to land safely. And this is where, once again, the first officer would need the EFB. As the plane headed south towards the ocean, the first officer pulled the EFB out of its stowage compartment. But when he retrieved it and checked the screen, he was stunned. Staring him in the face was the takeoff page he had used earlier, and the figure in the box for takeoff weight was a full 100 tons less than the aircraft's actual weight. At this moment, he realised his mistake. His lapse in attention had nearly caused the deaths of almost 300 people. But the first officer barely had time to process this when, behind him, the augmenting first officer pointed out something concerning. The aircraft was not pressurizing. The pilots exchanged glances as the terrible truth sunk in. When the tail had scraped against the runway, it had done so with such force that the skin of the aircraft itself had been worn away, creating multiple holes. The plane was no longer a sealed vessel. But there was no more time to think about what went wrong on takeoff. The pilots had to get on with the task at hand. The captain declared a pan-pan to air traffic control. Pan-pan is the international urgency signal over the radio. It's one step below declaring a mayday. Flight 407 would now be given priority over other aircraft. Meanwhile, air traffic control dispatched vehicles to the runway to inspect the damage. In a few moments, they would be shocked by what they discovered. As this happened, the four pilots began discussing how much fuel they should dump before landing. And here, they had an important balance to strike. On one hand, they wanted to land under their maximum landing weight of 243 tons. Any heavier than that, and they risked damaging the aircraft on landing, a proposition made all the riskier by the fact that they didn't know quite how badly damaged the tail already was. However, at the same time, getting down to this weight would require dumping almost all of their fuel. What if, for some reason during their approach, they needed to go around and make a second or even a third attempt at landing? If this happened, they would need plenty of fuel. But doing this would require them to be overweight for their first landing attempt. It was a tough choice to make, trying to strike a balance between not landing too heavy and yet still having enough fuel to make multiple attempts. In the end, the pilots decided that they would dump 80 tons of fuel. This would get their weight down to 280 tons, still above the maximum landing weight of 243 tons, but with enough to spare if they needed to make a few attempts at landing. This time, the pilots weren't going to take any chances when calculating their weight. Between them, they made 3 independent calculations for landing performance, 2 of them using the EFB, and 1 of them using the aircraft's quick reference handbook. But why hadn't this same level of attention been paid to these vital calculations on the ground? The pilots would never even have found themselves in this position were it not for the fact that a simple error had slipped through all of the safeguards while the plane was at the gate. Part of the problem was that while parked at the gate, the sterile cockpit rule didn't apply. In a sterile cockpit, there can be no conversation about anything other than the flight at hand. This rule is enforced during high workload stages of flight, like while manoeuvring on the ground, and any time below 10,000 feet. But because it doesn't apply when planes are parked at the gate, there was plenty of non-pertinent conversation in the cockpit during that point. This created an environment where distraction was inevitable. But what about the augmenting pilots? Weren't they supposed to be taking part in the pre-flight preparations too? How come they hadn't noticed that anything was amiss? As it turned out, while the augmenting captain would typically check the takeoff performance calculations using a second EFB in the cockpit, he had been unable to retrieve it from its compartment on this night, due to the fact that there were 2 ground engineers in the cockpit as well. The augmenting first officer, for his part, wasn't even present for most of these preparations. He was in the forward galley, waiting for the ground engineers to leave the cockpit. There was simply too much going on in the cockpit at this time for the pilots to follow the procedures to their full extent. Another problem for all of the pilots was that none of the figures generated by the EFB looked particularly off. And that's because all of these pilots also flew or had flown the Airbus A330, the smaller 2-engine version of the A340, where such weights and takeoff performance figures were quite typical. The kind of miscalculations the pilots experienced, therefore, were not like those seen in fields such as medicine, where one can be off by a factor of 10 or even 100 when it comes to dosages. This smaller range of possible values meant that the pilot's errors were harder to detect, and for that reason, they were all the more insidious. But now, 7,000 feet above the ocean, with a damaged tail and a plane that wouldn't pressurize, such reflections were of little importance. The pilots had a plane filled with 257 passengers who needed to be delivered safely back to the airport. The controller radioed the flight and told the crew that ground engineers had inspected the runway. They had found parts of the aircraft's skin and broken pieces of equipment off the end of the runway, including a light and some antennae. Whatever damage the plane had, it must be serious. The captain made his first public address to the passengers, informing them that there had been a tail strike on takeoff and that they would be dumping fuel and returning to the airport. Many of the passengers were frightened. The grinding noise of the plane's skin against the runway, coupled with the red glow from all the sparks, had been terrifying. The flight attendants readied the cabin for landing, and the pilots started dumping fuel. As the fuel streamed out the nozzles on the trailing edges of the wings at a rate of 2.5 tons per minute, the captain kept the aircraft flying close to Melbourne in case he needed to return in a hurry. To the pilots, the only indication of what had happened to the plane was a message which appeared on their central display. To get a better understanding of the damage, they would need to ask the flight attendants sitting in the rear galley. The captain called the lead flight attendant into the cockpit, asking what observations they had from the takeoff and trying to get an insight into the extent of the damage in the back of the aircraft. At this point, the situation appeared to be under control. The pilots finished the fuel dump at about 25 minutes past 11 that night and began their descent towards Melbourne. But just moments into their descent, they heard an unusual rumbling noise. Then, before the crew could work out what this might be, they got the most terrifying news yet. One of the flight attendants called the cockpit from the back of the aircraft and told them that they could see and smell smoke. The pilots needed to get back to the airport immediately. They knew that with the fire on board, they would have less than 20 minutes before they came crashing into the sea. The first officer radioed the tower, telling them of their intention to return immediately. They abandoned their plans to land on runway 16, which the winds favoured, instead opting for a straight-in approach to the reciprocal runway, runway 34. Even notwithstanding the possible fire, this posed a challenge all of itself. Not only were the pilots landing overweight, with possible damage due to a tail strike, but now they would be landing faster than usual because of the tailwind. The pilots quickly began setting the plane up for landing. The first officer told the lead flight attendant to prepare for a possible evacuation on landing. In a fire, every second counts. Meanwhile, the tower controller at Melbourne mobilised the airport's fire and rescue services to the runway. Here was a plane that had narrowly escaped disaster on takeoff, and now it appeared that it was about to face a second disaster on landing. The pilots lowered the gear and the flaps. It was a tense approach, as the captain flew the plane down towards runway 34. When he touched down, he would need to brake heavily to bring the overweight plane to a stop on the runway. In a terribly ironic twist, he was now at risk of running the plane off the end of the runway for a second time in the same night. At 36 minutes past 11, Flight 407 whooshed above the runway lights of runway 34, one of which it had smashed through just about an hour ago. It flew over the scratched runway, and moments later, touched down. The captain slammed on the brakes and brought the engines into reverse thrust. The first officer announced the speeds as the aircraft continued decelerating. After a few heart-pounding moments, the massive plane finally came to a stop, right at the end of the runway. Miraculously, the rescue vehicles reported no signs of fire. All 257 passengers and 18 crew had survived. Later that night, when the pilots and cabin crew had reached their hotel in Melbourne, Emirates contacted each of them by phone and forbade them from contacting their family or loved ones, saying that they would closely monitor their mobile phones and room phones. They then fired the pilots upon their return to Dubai. Public relations antics aside, the lessons from Flight 407 applied to pilots and airlines across the industry. Since this close call in March of 2009, new flight management computers have built-in software which alerts pilots if the takeoff performance figures they enter are sufficient to get the plane off the ground in the given runway length. At Emirates, and at many other airlines, 2 pilots are now required to independently calculate the takeoff performance figures to ensure that a single calculation can't cause a disaster. These improvements, along with many others in the latest generation of aircraft from Boeing and Airbus, make events like Flight 407 far less likely. If you enjoyed this video, you can get early access to new videos and support the channel by joining these people here on Patreon. Or if you'd like to watch another video now, check this one up here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.